Hello, my name is Andrea Wilson, and I'm the curator of the Craigleith Heritage Depot. And welcome to Our Military Heritage. This series just shares with you just a few of the hundreds of stories that share our military past from the town of the Blue Mountains. In my previous sessions, I featured the 19th and 20th centuries. And last week, I was talking about World War I, and I'm going to continue with that today. In particular, I'm going to talk about what people did back at home during the war. The museum has a project underway right now called Our Military Heritage, and we have received a grant from Veterans Affairs Canada, who's provided support for the digitization of the museum's collection and also any collections in the public. The museum collection's donated by the public and cared for by our professional staff for our collective memory and our future. And we're bringing this all together online on the museum's website, our virtual museum page, and you can go there and look at all of our online resources, including our military heritage. And that's going to grow throughout the summer, and we're intending to have a virtual launch of the project in September, so look for that. If you want to be a part of this project, if you have memories from your own family or friends or ancestors, please let us know at depot@thebluemountains.ca. Now, our small rural community, we can see how many people were living there in 1911 through the census. And at that time, 3,600 people were living in the town of the Blue Mountains area. And it was known as the Township of Collingwood and the town of Thornbury. So they were two separate entities at that time. So far, excuse me, we have documented about 190 individuals who volunteered for the war effort in a military capacity. However, the rest of the community was not sitting back idle at this time. They were active supporters of, from family, friends, neighbors, schoolmates, of all those who went overseas. This was a key part of the war effort, and it happened on several fronts. One was fundraising for the troops through the war bonds. And in our community, unfortunately, we don't have newspapers from 1914 at the outbreak of the war. Our newspapers, for some reason, we are still looking for those years, but we have it from October 24th, 1918. So I had to go outside of the community, but the Flesherton Advance often covered our southern part of our township. And in the Flesherton Advance in August of 1916, these ads were starting to appear. Save your money for the Dominion War Loan. So you would be able to invest in Canada and invest in the military and receive interest payments at the end of the war. So that was fundraising. So the community did fundraising, and also another way that they supported the war effort was to provide resources for the Allies. And that was through, in our community, a lot through agriculture and production of goods. Many of our young men were off to war and had left the farms. And it was a challenge for us to feed the nation, feed the war effort, and support our allies overseas. So farm labor shortages certainly happened. And this is from the War Museum in Ottawa. And what was established was a group called Soldiers of the Soil, Boys to the Front. And it was a national initiative run by the Canadian Food Board encouraging adolescent young boys to volunteer for farm service. And they recruited 22,385 young men across the country. Often they came from urban high schools and lived on rural farms, supporting the farmers. And we don't have documentation of that in our community, but I'm really curious to know if anybody has family members from here who had that experience. In exchange for their labors, soldiers of the soil received room and board spending money. And in the case of high school students, exemption from classes and final exams. On completion of their term, they received an honorable discharge and a badge acknowledging their service. But it wasn't just men that did that. For women, it was the farmerettes. And the Canadian War Memorial Funds commissioned paintings. And here is one of them. It's not a great shot. They commissioned paintings and sculptures depicting women's work on the home front as part of its project to document Canada's participation. And that painting's by Manly Edward MacDonald, and that was apple picking. So that's definitely one of the things you would see happening in our community. But those farm laborers and locals were also being kind of poached in some way. And this is an ad, again, it's hard to see there. It's from the Flesherton Advance, and they're looking for farm laborers. This is in 1916 in August. And they're looking for them for out west, and they're advertising here to get farm laborers out west for the, definitely for the wheat harvest. So it was a real challenge. Now, in the Flesherton Advance as well, just 3 weeks after the war was declared, the Women's Institute held a county-wide meeting, and Mrs. Walter Buchanan, or Mary Buchanan, who was the president of the Ravenna Women's Institute, was there, and she put forward and passed a motion to support the hospital ships. So this is right at the very beginning. And the Women's Institute came up to the fore with this. So they were providing money and materials like linens, nightshirts, clothing, bandages, and more. This effort was documented, and Mrs. Buchanan was not only the Women's Institute head, but she was also a local poet. And she wrote and published this book of poetry and dedicated it to those who served. Several of the poems were to inspire support and acknowledge the work at home and abroad for peace. So one of the poems is Farmers and the War, or Oats and Potatoes. I'm just going to read the first 2 stanzas. Ho, farmers of this country, the call comes forth today for oats and for potatoes, which we must send away to help to feed our army, of which we must take care. And then there's France and Belgium, who also needs a share. So there's several poems in here that relate to that marching through Germany sung. And the other one I really wanted to point out was one called the Knitting Brigade. And this relates to the Women's Institute, the Red Cross, lots of people knitting for the war effort. And I just want to read the very last stanza for this one. On, Canadian soldiers, bravely take your knocks. Think of nimble fingers, busy knitting socks. So there was this sense of direct communication with the family members, community members who were at the front, and definitely letters back and forth were really supportive and were valued by the people who had gone overseas. That was a key thing. And giving hope, connection, and communication from back home was important, but also in our own community, it was inspiring people to enlist. So we heard about Lieutenant Colonel Hilliard, who was doing that. But there's this great little article that came into the Flesherton Advance, again, August 17th, and I had to read it. And it writes, it's one of the columns under news. A young man who ought to enlist received a deserved rebuke from a young lady he was calling upon lately. The young lady was knitting a pair of socks, and the young man, in order to make conversation, remarked that it was nice to see her knitting socks for the soldiers at the front. Her reply, "These socks are not for a soldier," he was told. Then he inquired. He was told they were to be presented to himself as soon as completed, to keep your cold feet warm. I found that quite humorous. But the community was also there to support friends and family at the front by managing their finances and their farms while they were away. And this was like farmer Alfred Frost, who came to Ravenna area as a home child to work on William Fields's farm. And he was a very young man when he came. I have a picture of him here. It's not the greatest. It is online. But he's this young man to the side, and I apologize for the I apologize for that shadow, but he's this young man here. He's also in our May newsletter, so if you get that from the library, it's a better picture there. He was working on the Fields farm, and he created a strong relationship with the community there, not only with the Fields family, but also with the Pinch family. And that can be noted in Alfred's attestation papers, because they're listed as next of kin, as the person who one of them was managing his finances through the Hartman Bank in Clarksburg. That occurred until one day, while he was in a military hospital in Europe, recovering from the mumps, his British sister, who became a nurse, found him and they reunited. And according to family history, she was the first to document that he was underage, so he was only a teen when he actually enlisted. And our volunteer researcher, Chris, has found the home children documents and his listing there to show that that was true. He was only a teenager. Alfred did return after the war, and his ancestors still honor him every November at the Ravenna Cenotaph. And finally, when all was said and done, the community commemorated the efforts of those who volunteered. Local families and organizations like the Women's Institute were instrumental in fundraising for the cenotaphs in Ravenna and in the community cenotaph in Thornbury. And now we have a new location right on the border of Thornbury and Clarksburg, and a beautiful site there, which was established last year. So every November we can gather to ensure we'll never forget the willingness of local men and women to volunteer to serve in the war effort and volunteer at home to support them long term. So thank you for joining me today. It's hard to leave World War I because there's so many stories, but next week we're going to move forward and into World War II. So I hope you can join me, and thank you for watching today. Leave me a note, tell me what you think. Like our page if you want, and I appreciate it. Share it with as many people as you can. And I'm really curious to see if other people have stories about the community efforts during either wars. Please share that with me, and we would love to share them if you would like through our community portal and our online site. Thank you very much.